Hi, everybody. Welcome to Hope TV. Today we have Dr. Kari Nixon. She's our assistant professor of English at Whitworth University. She teaches medical humanities, Victorian literature, and is a scholar of infectious disease outbreaks and their impact on society. Welcome, Dr. Nixon. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So just to give everybody a little bit of background, Stars of Hope, goes out into the world, and we work with, those have been affected by man-made and natural disasters, to reach out and work with them to work in therapeutic, artistic ways to find ways to cope with their loss of whatever has happened. But of course, since we are now all not able to travel and we're all stuck at home, we're now trying to find ways to reach them in other ways, virtually, since they are at home. So when I was researching, I found what you did, which I thought was so impactful and interesting. And I wanted to start a discussion with you, and hopefully you can share about the article you wrote for online about the blanket you created. Which it was very much like a personal journey that I think would be really impactful to hear about. So I don't know where you would like to start with that.
Yeah, maybe first would be easiest to just describe what the project was in the blanket, because I'm assuming most people probably haven't read the article. Oh, there's a link. I just saw it pop up. So anybody in the knitting world is probably familiar with a thing called a temperature blanket, which apparently I decided to make one this year just for something to do. And I guess they were so trendy like a couple of years ago that they're now considered kind of basic or not cool anymore, but I just wanted to do one. And it's where you knit, you assign different colors for different temperature ranges. So 50 to 60 degrees might be red, and 60 to 70 degrees might be blue. And so then every day you knit one row according to that temperature. And I kind of like the idea in general to just mark a passage of time. I think time is kind of a fascinating concept, and we are often not very mindful of it as we go about our daily grind, and we're rushing to work and we're trying to get dinner on the table. And so I just thought it was a cool concept. And little did I know, 8 weeks into 2020, when I was making this temperature blanket, that we would be hit with the biggest pandemic since 1918. And since I'm a scholar of the social and emotional impact of infectious disease, and particularly isolation on humans, I wanted to do something similar. Now, I'm not a scholar of domestic arts. There are people who just completely study the domestic arts in the 19th century. But I was aware, I do teach a little bit about that, of a history of women using textile arts as a form of lamentation or protest, particularly in the 19th century that I specialize in, when most women were sort of told, this is all you're allowed to do. You can make tea for people and you can knit. There were a particular type of really boss women in my mind that said, okay, all I can do is knit, I'll knit you this. And I think, Kelly, I emailed you a thing that I teach every year, that it's a woman, she was a servant, and she knit a cross-stitch sampler telling about her violent rape at the hands of her employer and how traumatized she was. And I mean, it's haunting and chilling and sad, but it's also, I see it as a big middle finger to what she was living through and to her trauma, and this sort of sadness, but also this sort of aggro move in a low-key way. We have to read between the lines a little bit to see that, to see cross-stitching as aggro. But within a society that said women are only allowed this one means of expression, to sort of turn that against that society. So as I was sitting here and just thinking about all these deaths, I sort of pulled those two together and began knitting a blanket where each row was a different color for the daily global death toll And so you can see it was hard to make. I'm not a very good knitter. I just do squares. I do square blankets because I don't want to learn patterns. But for this, I had to figure out how to make each row a different length so that it resembled what I call a demented bar graph. I don't want it to be pretty because I felt ugly. I felt ugly feelings thinking about this death. And particularly me and the country that I'm in, I have certain issues with the way national and local government handled it. Certainly, pandemic disease is more akin to a natural disaster than anything, but it can be mitigated or exacerbated by government, as can anything. And so the fact that, so I had a scale. It was supposed to be 1 stitch per 10 deaths. And at some point, my husband's a math teacher, and I used to be a statistician, but I've clearly forgotten everything. And we were looking at it and we were like, why do I have 150 stitches for 5,766 deaths? That's no kind of scale. There's no scale that works for that. I completely lost control of it. And I liked that. Like, I feel like, I'm 34 and most of the time I'm like, is there an adult in the house? Like, not my house, the national house. Like, is anybody in control of this ship that we're all on? And I kind of liked that the blanket got out of control and messy and ugly, and it helped me feel that rage and that grief in a way that I could feel. Like, maybe this sounds masochistic, but I wanted my hands to feel tired. I wanted to feel something instead of this theoretical loss of people that I've never met. Or if any of us have personally lost somebody, it might be one person, not hundreds of thousands. That was a very long answer. Sorry.
No, that was amazing. There's something very powerful taking the intangible and making it tangible. It's just, I think a lot of us can relate to the enormity of what the heck is going on now. Even as things are supposedly, states are opening up, maybe, kind of, we still don't know what's ahead of us. But looking back to where you were talking about, there's no way to really quite understand the scale of it. So
yes,
to process it, I can see where making like one. I'm not a knitter, so I apologize if I'm not
stitch. It's just I don't really know that well either.
To stitch can equal something, and that's like, it can help make sense and process it. And what did it help ground or cope or any sort of manifestation that way?
So being, again, that I study the history of infectious diseases, and particularly what I study is the history of people being able to look under a microscope and see bacteria. One thing that I think about a lot is, you said a really good scale. I think a lot about the human capacity to imagine things at scale. We're not that great at imagining microscopic things very well. And the same with large numbers, billions and trillions. Our brains can't do that. And so for me, making it something I could hold in my hands, and at least when I had control of the scale, knowing like this stitch right here, that was 10 people that I'll never know, but contributed something to their families and had unique gifts and contributions and personalities that will never exist again. My brain could do that. My brain could do 10 and then 10 and then 10, and then could feel the emotional and mental exhaustion of that activity in a way that doesn't happen when you're looking at a news ticker. It's way too theoretical, I think. I've written elsewhere in another article for Yes Magazine about the way that our sort of amazing medical privilege in the West has made death less of a constant in our culture. And that sort of cyclically developed a sense in which we don't want to face death. We have a whole funeral industry. If you've ever read Caitlin Doty's work, about the funeral industry. We've developed that to get it away from us. And my first article that I wrote for Yes Magazine had to do with the fact that the result in American culture primarily has been that we have no tangible mourning rituals for coping with death. And I think Stars of Hope is obviously very connected with this idea, because by going out to places that have been stricken with trauma and grief and saying, here's something we can do. There's an important use of ritual in our society. I think, well, in all societies, human society, I think we felt that very much as graduations and weddings and baby showers have been canceled. I mean, I, perhaps more than anyone, kind of cringe when I have to go to another baby shower. But now that I can't go to any, I'm realizing that served a really important function. And I think the same is true of death and mourning rituals. And so, whereas in my first article for Yes Magazine, I was just lamenting the fact that American society has just, in wanting to believe that we can just not deal with death, we've robbed ourselves of a means of coping with death. And so for me, again, this blanket, the subject of my second article for Yes, was me just trying to build something to do, some ritual to have in a society where we've deluded ourselves into believing we don't need those things. And I think Stars of Hope, your mission makes it very clear that we do need tangible ways to process. We do need art and therapy and ritual to get us through things that are intangible because they're existential, and spiritual, intangible because they're too big to imagine.
I wrote down from the Yes article you wrote, it's a messy, undisciplined blanket, which I really appreciated, and that it screams the chaos of grief, which I think that describes it perfectly. Which I wonder, as the blanket now, is it complete? Do you feel like?
So the pictures you showed are my completed blanket. I actually have it here, but since you showed the picture, and it's so big, it's hard to hold up. It's probably best to just stick with the picture that you showed. But yeah, it's finished, but it's not, right? I wanted to keep going. I had white thread for the lowest death threshold. You can see it up just at the very top there back in January, a little bit again in February, there's white. I was saving it. In the article, I say I almost felt like my husband and we wrapped it up and we put it in a shelf, almost like you would save a bottle of champagne for this. We were so excited to get to this moment when we were back down to global death tolls in the hundreds that we could comprehend. But it became clear to me that wasn't happening anytime soon. And the blanket became kind of a weight to me, or a thing I didn't want to deal with anymore. Every day it was waiting for me, and one row would take 30 minutes just to knit because it was so big. And I would get days behind, and I have 2 young kids, so I have about 90 minutes to myself every day. And to think that I had to spend that 90 minutes doing this thing, I felt eventually that it had served its purpose for me, and as a way to communicate ideas to society of what we could do to process this, and had become no longer a healing and helpful thing or a means of processing, but something that I dreaded. And so I felt it had served its purpose for me. And in a way, I felt like it was also meaningful that I couldn't do it, that I couldn't get through it all. I couldn't actually keep up with it, because that is how I feel. I can't emotionally or imaginatively keep up with the number of deaths. That's how we all feel. So for the blanket to...
And that's okay.
Yeah, to be able to let that go and say, like, I think you said that really well. Like, I think with grief, right? Grief never ends. it's something that goes on and you process it differently over time. And so that too marked a shift in my processing, that saying this stage of it is done, this thing that I needed here. And with knitting, where you actually cut the thread and you're done with the project, you can't really go back. Yeah, that marked a means of processing for me as well. Yeah, and I think was really meaningful for me to be able to say, like, I'm not going to be tied to this means of coping anymore. I'm going to let myself move on to maybe different ways that I need to cope with this now.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Like the cutting of the knit. That's very powerful.
And I didn't expect it to be.
There was a question for Dr.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say, I didn't expect
we'll
it to be powerful. I tend to be kind of a workaholic, and I first felt it was a form of defeat to give up. But I've heard this in people dealing with grief as well. Wordsworth has a really famous poem called Surprised by Joy. After a death, he sees something in nature and he's happy, and then he almost feels bad about feeling happy. And people can feel that it's a loss to give up their grief at some point when they've had a death in their lives. And that's its own stage to say, like, no, it's okay to move on to this next phase of me as I process this. Oh, yeah, I saw that we had a question.
Yeah. Wow. For Dr. Nixon, how does she feel with vicarious PTSD and specifically, if possible, with COVID?
I think the closest I've had to vicarious PTSD is in watching some of my students. I'm a college professor, and there were definitely students that were in crisis during this time. Home is not safe for everybody, whether that be emotionally or physically. And that was often hard because I couldn't physically do anything to help them. And I don't know that I have a better answer to that than anybody. I suppose, hopefully I'm not just sounding like a broken record, but developing tangible means of coping with, yes, death, but like I've tried to tell my students and people I meet, like there's 1,000 little deaths happening with COVID.
I think we lost your sound. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Did we lose your sound?
It's working for me. Okay. There's like actual deaths, of course, but there's also the people that had to reschedule their weddings. I met a student recently that she lost her track season, and I guess that the NCAA was going to give them back a season. I don't really know sports, but because of her ROTC commitment, she just never gets to have that track season. And so, you know, I've been trying to validate for my students that everybody's losses and that those are valid, and it's okay to grieve those even if they're not a physical death. But let's see, Jeff, there was another thought I had about vicarious PTSD. Oh, that's what I was thinking. I guess, Jeff, like, that's such an on-the-nose question. Like, it's so on point for me. I feel I'm very emotional as a human in the world, and I think maybe risk that a lot because I feel these things so deeply, even when it's not necessarily happening to me. And my means of coping with what scares me, for instance, could we feel something so deeply that it emotionally traumatizes us? My means of handling that is very much to like stare it in the face and keep confronting it until it doesn't scare me anymore. And so I think that's why I develop projects like this, to sort of stare in the face of what I find scary, and until I can cope with it, and it doesn't scare me anymore. And we have decent evidence in cognitive behavioral therapy that, you know, the way we cure phobias is by confronting the thing in graduated little by little. So if you're scared of a spider, you have a phobia of spiders, you might confront an image of a spider and wait until you stop being scared, until your heart rate calms down a bit. And then maybe you look at a spider in a cage and you look at that until it doesn't scare you. And so I think that's what I have been for many, many years trying to do with death and disease, is just confront it and confront it and confront it until it doesn't scare me. And one thing that I've been kind of thinking about recently is the way a lot of people in the OCD community with classic fears of contamination have felt very seen by COVID, as though I've seen people say that now they feel like people know what they go through in dealing with OCD and fears of contamination, that the general populace is seeing what they live through, which is great from a disability studies perspective. One thing I've seen, though, is that there is sort of a increasing slide towards risk aversion now in broad society, because what we know from cognitive behavioral therapy, again, is that if you have an obsession, like a fear of germs, the compulsion, let's say hand washing, it's like an addictive cycle. It will make you feel a little bit better for a little while that you washed your hands. But because it makes you feel better for a little while, it becomes this addictive cycle where you have to wash and wash and wash. And I have been a little concerned that I'm seeing that on a collective scale now, that whereas hand washing might not have been that important before, and fears of germs and infectious diseases might not have been at the forefront of people's minds, now we're seeing people, it's almost like the goalposts have changed a little bit. Now people are nervous about there being any risk at all. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm not purporting to make recommendations about broad public health practices and when cities should open. That's not my expertise. What is my expertise in my book is about the way that germ theory catalyzed a collective human desire for and belief that we could live completely without risk. And what I'm hoping is that society doesn't go back to that aversion, which I'm kind of seeing this collective sort of obsessive compulsive cycle, that staying home reduced X, Y, and Z amount of risk, so we should just do that forever. And while opening up without regulations and plans is not the answer, staying home forever also isn't. And I think my hope for society is that we can find this middle ground together. And that will require many more experts than just me. I saw a question about the OCD. Yes, I've seen so many people really grateful in some ways that this has allowed people to see what they live through. As people in the lay public are saying, you know, I don't know how much washing is too washing. And there has been some gratitude in the OCD community feeling seen for these things.
Wow, very much so. I apologize that there was a little technical difficulty, so thank you, Dr. Nixon.
That's all right.
So you may have touched this while I was the technical difficulty, but I wonder, looking back, like the history of infectious disease and its impact on society about cope and keeping hope today and for tomorrow is what can we learn and start implementing ourselves in that way? Which is a huge question, but I don't know if anything immediately pops up from your studies.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking a little bit. I mean, I think the risk moderation that I was just discussing for me is a key part of it. My book that just came out is titled Kept from All Contagion, Germ Theory, Disease, and the Dilemma of Human Contact. And my thesis there, which, I started writing this years ago, it had nothing to do with COVID. My thesis is that we can never be fully kept from contagious disease, and all human contact comes with risk. And I guess one means of hope is that I saw society dealing with this in the 1880s when they first realized that most diseases are contagious. And there was this sort of knee-jerk reaction to try to individually isolate, not the sort of isolating we're doing now, which I find very communally minded of protecting all of us for everyone, but a sort of almost prepper mentality of like, I'm going to go build this hut over here and I'll be okay, but the rest of you might die. And what I saw is society working through that, and eventually by, 15 years later, almost 1900, they develop an awareness of probiotics, that we can't just play whack-a-mole with all infection and think that we live as humans, even as a human species, an isolated life from not only just other humans, but also the microbiome that we live in. Hi, Dad. And so that gives me hope that like society 150 years ago grappled with this question and came out on the other side of it with the development of probiotics as early as 1900 that are the precursor of our modern sewage systems. They actually realized they could keep disease at bay by employing bacteria to help them. And now we have the concept of One Health, which is I believe a WHO funded organization. One Health is the idea that human and animal and bacterial lives are all intertwined, and we can't have one without the other. And obviously none of us wants to die from a viral or bacterial infection, but that these things aren't just universally and unanimously bad. So the fact that society, 150 years ago, we might see them as very backwards and less progressive than we are, but to think that, they were actually kind of advanced in thinking through these things, that gives me hope that we can make those same moves too. I had another thought. The other thing, and I've just been thinking about this a lot, I mean, sometimes when we think about the individual virus and the individual human life, I think it's easy to see the human body as incredibly frail, like a junker car that's always about to slip its gears, where we just seem to live in this like fragile balance where something as small as a virus or a bacteria can throw us off. But collectively, humanity is pretty darn amazing, and viruses are just bits of code, for better or worse, that can't really do much without us. But the human race, I mean, we invented fire. We somehow survived as cavemen through like tigers, and we looked at coconuts and one day decided that somehow we were going to eat that. We've done a lot of things over the history of being a species that I think give us more grit and determination, and it is that hope and emotional resilience that gives us an edge over other threats and natural disasters over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think starting from the article you wrote, Dr. Nixon, to about just recognizing that it's okay to sit with the grief, recognize that there's grief, you can lament and create, express something about it, but also that collectively we do have grit. We've overcome before and we can overcome again. and that perhaps like something will come out of this, like probiotics, or whatever other things have come out of epidemics before. There's positives that can come out of it.
Right. And in fact, one thing that is in my book, you're reminding me, sometimes I can't see the forest for the trees, but that, again, like, of course we don't want disease, and of course we don't want death from these things. But one thing authors that I covered in the 1880s often demonstrated is that these things, these moments often give us a pause and an ability to almost reset society and think through the things that weren't working, and to use the language of the authors I cover, that were already morally diseased in society anyway. So one great example is the sort of casual disregard American society has for its homeless population. Well, now that the homeless population can be considered by some to be a public health issue, where are we going to put them? How are we going to house them? That might give us a moment to also stop and think about how we could do better by those people, because as the One Health movement demonstrates, their health is our health and our health is their health, and we don't live on separate islands. So I think one hope that I have, and I've been on a podcast recently with a comedian, and he was hoping that in a society where we become already so isolated, in the middle class, most of us just stay home and watch Netflix all the time anyway, maybe this would give people a resurgence for caring about live entertainment, for instance. I certainly saw that the second the pandemic, people in America were realizing we were going to be on lockdown. I mean, there was a run on the craft stores to get it back to art and art therapy. I mean, people knew that when you are stuck in a stressful situation, we need art and music and literature and theater. Like, that's what people are wanting. And I think that is a surprisingly great moment for hope and a reset to say, in a world where we're defunding the arts and humanities at a rapid race. I see my mom on here trying to outdo my dad. She says she's not trying to outdo him, but she is a little low key. And I just would like to mention that it was my mom that showed me my love of Victorian literature and needlework. She is like a famous Instagram embroiderer. And I always impress my students by showing her like 30,000 followers on Instagram. And she was the one that would always tell me, like, this is a means of thinking through things and therapy. And
Wow.
So check it out. She's the best. Like, I think, that's one inroad that's, I think, very connected to the Stars of Hope message, that people have seen that there is a need for art. Like, of course, we can't say there's not a need for science, because I think we're all very much hopeful that the scientists are out there working day and night to fix this. Mm-hmm. That's the biological side. But what my work has always striven to do is say there's also the emotional and social side. And the emotional and social side of us, for the majority of us who are sitting at home waiting for there to be a cure, we've turned to the arts and theater and humanities to give us hope and resilience in this time. And I hope that will give us a renewed appreciation for those fields.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Doctor, that was very inspiring, Dr. Nixon.
Thank you. Oh, that's my best friend. Hi, Amy. She's a biochemist, and she supports my work more than anyone, I think. And it always gives me hope for society that there are scientists out there that appreciate the arts.
Oh, there are. We're all in this together. That's cool. Well, Dr. Nixon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. It's great to meet you. I hope to, we can touch base in a couple months and see where we are, and maybe in a better place. Good luck with your book that's coming out soon. When is it coming out?
It came out.
I'm sorry.
Now, I think it comes out June 1st.
Okay. So we'll all be on the lookout for that. So thank you so much, Dr. Kari Nixon, on this great interview. And thank you, everybody, for watching Hope TV today. And we'll see you next time.